Good day, and welcome to this first in a series of programs on discussions on discriminatory laws against LGBT people, and that is lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender. In studio with us today to lead the discussion, we have Honorable Gail Teixeira, Member of Parliament, former Minister in the Ministries of Health, Culture, Youth and Sport, and Home Affairs. She's also Cabinet Member and Presidential Advisor on Governance from 2006 to present. She's also the Chief Whip of the Government in the 10th Parliament and a Member of Parliament for the last 19 years. She also is an Executive Member of the PPPC government, or rather the People's Progressive Party. We also have with us Mr. Andrew Hicks, the Head Department of Sociology, University of Guyana, and he's a sociologist. And Mr. Simpson, the founder and co-chair of the Society Against Sexual Orientation Discrimination, or otherwise known as SASOD, and is a local human rights organization which represents the interests of lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgender in Guyana. And he's working towards ending discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in our country. Joel holds a Bachelor's of Law degree from the University of Guyana, and his interest includes homophobia, human rights, gender sexuality, and sexual health. I'm Raymon Cummings, and I'll be leading you in these discussions. The discussions will focus on the human rights, the report of the working group on the Universal Periodic Review that was presented in May and September 2010 at the United Nations Human Rights Council. That report, Ms Texeira was there and presented that report. Coming out of that report was a commitment by Guyana, and that commitment reads that Guyana is voluntarily committed to holding consultation on the issue over the next 2 years based on the outcome of a democratic process of consultations. And the issue is discrimination against persons based on their sexual orientation. And we will get into our discussions, and I'll start by asking each person to give an opening statement on the issue at hand. We'll start with you, Andrew.
Well, certainly, thank you for having me on this program. I do believe that it is essential that we engage in the public by bringing together also persons who have some expertise in the behavioral sciences, in politics and human rights, so that we can craft a position on the issue. I do believe that the issue of sex, sexuality, and gender are very sensitive and very often is seldom spoken about in public. And therefore, I commend the consultative process in terms of moving the change process forward. So indeed, I'm happy to participate and to lend my perspective as a sociologist to the discussion.
Joel, could we have an opening statement from you?
Well, thank you for having me on the program. I think for SASOD, this is a very important milestone. We have been working on these issues related to discrimination on the grounds of sexual orientation and gender identity for several years. And the issue of repealing these laws is central to our work. We have maintained that these laws perpetuate stigma and discrimination in all sectors of people's lives, if they're lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. And this is the first step, really, towards full equality and citizenship for people from these communities. So I'm glad to be part of these discussions.
Ms Texeira.
Well, thank you, Raymond, and thank you for Joel and Andrew for agreeing to come on this program. This is a controversial issue, but one I believe as Guyanese that we can address, we can discuss, and we can discuss in a rational and sober way. I have been identified by the government to be the lead person to facilitate the discussions on this issue. And just to let the public know that when Guyana went before the UPR, that we presented our report and the recommendations made by different countries on a number of issues. And there were 7 recommendations dealing with removing discrimination or discriminatory laws in relation to people who were based on their sexual orientation or gender identity. And so we made a commitment of what we're going to do. Well, in the meantime, we've had elections and all sorts of things have got in the way. But I believe that this is the point now. We need to talk. And whatever happens, we have to report by October. If we're not concluded, it's okay. If we have concluded, it's good. If we've reached consensus, better yet. But the process is that I think it's important as Guyanese to talk about this, to be able to engage on this issue as with a number of other controversial issues. And we can set a pattern for how we as Guyanese, disagreeing and agree to disagree, can sit in a rational way. So this television interview is just to kickstart, and then we will have a whole process of consultations that will follow with civil society and national stakeholders. So I want to thank both gentlemen for agreeing to coming on the program, and let's begin talking about the issue of the rights of persons based on their sexual orientation and their gender identity.
Thank you, Ms. Texeira. This is the first of a discussion, and,
Yes.
and I think we need to get it clear that it's not a this is not a consultation.
Not yet.
It's not, we're not at the stage of consultation, and we're not repealing laws and changing laws. No decision is being taken. This is just a first in the discussion, and we want to let people begin to talk about these issues. So at the time, sometime later down, when a decision has to be made, which will involve all parties, when the actual consultation starts, all parties will be clear in their mind where these discussions are going, and they'll be clear in themselves as to what type of decisions they would want to make, and they would want to recommend to be made in this whole issue.
Yeah, I think you made several important points there, that there's a huge difference between dialogue and consultation.
Yeah.
And I think dialogue is an important part of the process. And the process itself is very important. I think we recognize that consultation is really a process and not an event.
Exactly.
It's not meetings,
Exactly.
it's about the process.
Yeah.
Okay.
And for us at SASOD, we think the process is equally important as the outcome. And we are advocating for an inclusive approach, a transparent approach that will bring partners on board in a civil and rational way, and increase buy-in for whatever outcomes that might come out at the end of the consultation process. So for us, having all the parliamentary parties at the table, having the academic community involved, having expertise in the area of gender, some of our civic institutions, like the Commission.
The legal persons too.
Yeah, the legal fraternity,
Health
the bar
practitioners.
associations, the human rights fraternity,
Social workers.
the Gender and Equality Commission, we have one. To have all of these entities involved in the process is very important as well.
Okay.
But I also believe that speaking about the whole process of the consultations is that one need not expect that you're going to have a decision tomorrow. It's not an attempt to treat with this issue as a metamorphosis, but rather to allow rational engagement. And I think over the process of time, you may very well find that people's disposition may change. And this can also help in terms of treating with some of the sensitivities in order to get people to recognize that there is a different perspective. For example, I think because of the hypersensitivity of sex, when people hear about the decriminalization of bias laws that treat with the issue of gender and sex, people only think homophobically, and sometimes it breeds homo-hatred, homo-violence, and those kinds of things. And I think the consultation process will allow people to recognize what really is the public's disposition in terms of engendering a new moral platform. And so, again, there are a lot of benefits that we can derive psychologically, politically, socially, and culturally in terms of exploring what are our prevailing cultural values, what aspect of the value system that needs to be reviewed, and we may very well find that there is a stronger level of embracing each other because of, regardless of their sexual identities. I hold very strong to the view that there is a significant difference between homosexuality and homosexual behavior. Okay. And so that in itself is something that we can also explore during the discussions.
You raised a point in that you were talking about our cultural values. Mm-hmm. Is it that the laws or the consultations, in the consultations, do you expect it to come out that our cultural values will change if we stop discriminating against persons who are lesbians, gays, bisexuals, or transgenders? Are you saying that by changing the laws, our values will change?
Well, let me try to answer a different angle, and then Andrew, and that is that laws reflect a society at the time where it is. Mm-hmm. Laws should be the expression of the society. The laws that we're talking about, that SASOD is talking about amending, go back to 1865. Mm-hmm. And so 1865 and 2012 are completely different worlds, not only globally, but in Guyana. Yeah. And so those laws come out of the British common law, etc., of 1865, as did the laws on abortion, as did the laws on rape and incest and all these laws. We have changed those laws. We have brought about the medical termination. We've got the Sexual Offences Act. This is probably one of the last leftovers of the 1865, some of the old laws. And so this is 2012. What are the views of Guyanese society, and what are its cultural values today? And how do they treat with the issue of rights? We cannot say as a people that yes, we want women's rights, we want Amerindian rights, we want to fight against discrimination on ethnicity and religion and persons with disabilities, and not talk about also those persons and what is our position on persons who have a sexual orientation is different from ours, or persons who have a gender identity. And I think we need to explain to the public that, and I'll be corrected by the sociologists and SASOD if I'm wrong, and that is that sex is what you're born with. Your DNA and everything, you're female or male. Your gender identity is what you see yourself as, whether it is heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual, transgender, and so on. Am I correct?
Well, not
not totally.
Okay, no. You explain it, because I'm not. I do know the DNA part.
Definitely,
yes.
Correctly. Sex is what you're born with. Gender, like you said, is what you feel psychologically inside.
Yes, yeah.
But your sexual orientation now is who you feel attracted to.
Okay.
You feel a propensity to be attracted to either someone of the same sex, of a different sex, or both.
Yeah.
So that's how you have a homosexual orientation, a heterosexual orientation, or a bisexual orientation. Now, your gender identity refers to that psychological feeling that you may have, whether you see yourself as male or female, or as transgender because the sex doesn't match the gender to you, or as the case might be.
Okay.
Well, I don't disagree with you, Joanne, but not that I'm attempting to defend Madam Teixeira.
No, that's okay.
But certainly
I'm learning.
It all depends on which theoretical perspective you are applying, because you also have the people who use the cognitive and psychosocial theoretical approach to analyze the very issue that we talk about, that fundamentally suggests that in the construct of gender there is identity. And so and part of your identity also have to do with your orientation. But I do understand what you're saying, because from the perspective of sexuality, the emphasis is on where do you seek or your preferred forms of sexual gratification. So I do understand. But I just thought that it's important for us to understand,
we need to understand
that there are different analytical approaches, and it's not that we may treat with one without recognizing the other, because these are all perspectives that have some level of validity.
Yeah, definitely.
And you may also get some other variations of the definitions from other persons.
Certainly. For example, if one were to apply the biological perspective, they would certainly attempt to summarize all of human behavior in the context of biology, which has really been subjected to severe criticisms.
Right.
We're talking about some laws, and I think this is what we need to get clear in our mind.
But Raymond, before you go, if I may interject, because I wanted also to come back to the whole issue that was raised in terms of changing values.
Okay, yeah.
I do not believe that once the law change, that people's values will change, because the whole issue of behavioral change is a process. It's really not an event.
Right.
And so I think the approach of the government is indeed commendable, because it allows people to engage rationally. And because you are using a rational process where you allow people to engage in reflective inquiry as their reasoning constructs, then it is possible that even without changing the law, values may change. So it's, you know, and therefore it makes it much easier to change the law.
I think
But I also
that is
think
the point that we need to get out, because in the medical termination of pregnancy, when we had that, the practice was already there. Persons were engaging in the practice.
But it was illegal.
And the law came a very long time after. The law actually came about to save lives. And we have to look at ourselves as a society and see what it is we're doing. And whether it's right for you to maintain laws that outlaw behavior that is present in society.
Right. And in fact, it's been in society for thousands of years. I mean, you know, where it's so that when I sometimes listen to some people, they're talking as if this is an occurrence of the 20th century or the 21st century. The issue of sexual behavior and heterosexual, bisexual, homosexual behavior has been there from probably the beginning. So that the way religion, culture, and so on deals with it tries to justify or not justify what it's about. We have to deal with, on this issue, as with the other issues that have been presented as from the UN Human Rights Council, the abolition of corporal punishment, the abolition of death penalty, and this issue. How do we deal with these issues? These are rights issues. The rights of individuals to be who they are, what they are. And if they're not harming anybody else, because the issues of your right to have a sexual partner, of what your preference is, must be, and the underlying thing in all the recommendations of consenting adults. So this view that you sometimes hear from people that this is pedophilia, this is, you know, and all sorts of very violent language, that you're not talking about that. Pedophilia is against the law. Absolutely against the law. And this is the recommendations, and this discourse does not surround making legal what is, you know, where minors and persons who voluntarily are not consenting. So if there was a relationship between men that was rape, then it is rape, once there's no consent. So I think we need to set those things carefully out, because the reaction to people is that, oh, you know, and I can hear it in my head, what is being said. So that we have to be very, very clear. Consenting adults making choices to do with their personal life, who they have sex with, who they live with, how they manage their lives. And not to do with condoning anything that would harm minors or would not have the consent of another adult.
I think Ms Texeira made a very important point that I want to underscore about the relationship between cultural values and human rights. I think as a society we have to understand that our individual values can't ever trample anyone else's human rights, or else we go down a slippery slope. Minorities of any type of minorities would never have their rights recognized or protected. And I think it's important to understand that regardless what are your own personal values, that cannot trample someone else's rights. You're still entitled to hold those views, but you can't enforce those against other people. Importantly to that as well, I think when we talk about cultural values, it's also important to kind of look at whether we're talking about individual values and the collective or the collective. I don't think we as a society believe that we have a right to discriminate against any particular group. I think people might hold very different views about different minority groups, but I don't think we have a collective belief that our cultural values as a Guyanese people is that we're allowed to discriminate against particular groups just because we don't like them. We could hold those views, which might be our own personal opinions, but I don't really think that's reflective of a Guyanese cultural politic.
No. That's the point I'm getting at now. We're not, the discussion is not whether persons should change their cultural views or whether they should accept the behavior as the norm in society.
Right.
The discussion is whether persons feel that they should discriminate, should or shouldn't, or society should or shouldn't discriminate against persons because of their sexual orientation.
I think you captured it very well.
Yeah, I think I share that that's the focus of the discussion, but I also believe that the discussion is all about promoting tolerance among diversity, promoting tolerance where there are differences, and so that we can really talk about the coexistence of our people as a plural community. In the same way that we would like to see our various ethnicities integrating and sharing and at the same time competing, we would also want to be sure that other minority groups outside of our ethnic groups are given equal opportunity to participate in the glorification of our nationalism, to put it that way. It's also about ensuring that we have a more peaceful society, because the intolerance for, let's say, homosexuality, gay life, lesbian life, transgender life, the intolerance for that tend to breed an element of homophobia, which transforms into all kinds of violence driven by hatred. And so the object here is that once you provide some space, then individuals who may consider themselves as different may no longer see the need to also want to be separate and violent in terms of invading the space of others. And I think that's what we're really seeking to promote, to reduce the violence and so on. I have not been able to check the statistics in Guyana, and I do not believe that our current statistical reports in terms of sex crimes allow us to capture this kind of data. But I think data coming out of the United States of America shows that 1/4 of all murders committed in the US are really homophobic or driven by homophobia. I have no doubt that when you look at, you hear some of the life stories of some people who have been the victims of violent crimes in Guyana, that there seem to be the manifestation of homophobia in some of the violence. And so here again, because some people, even though they engage in, let's say, transgender or homosexual activities, they worry about a whistleblower. And if there is the psychological fear that homophobia drives, and one feels that they're likely to be outed, put in the limelight, then they tend to react with violence. And so it's all about reducing violence, managing violent crimes, and at the same time promoting what I call tolerance among diversity.
But you raise a point, but even societies that have laws that prohibit discrimination against persons, lesbians, gays, bisexuals, and transgenders, even in those societies, you still have violence committed against these persons based strictly on their identity.
Right.
So it's not that we're asking society to change their values or the laws in itself, or changing the laws or making the laws less discriminatory. Is not saying that, look, you have to change your views. What it's saying is that we will not accept or tolerate as a society persons being discriminated against strictly because of their orientation.
Right. I think you made that point very clearly. I think it's also important to underscore the role that the discriminatory laws play in that. We have laws on our books which say if you engage in any form of intimacy as an adult male with another male in private, you can be imprisoned. In public or private, you know. You could be liable to a prison term. Any form of intimacy ranging from touching to actual penetrative sex, from 2 years to
10 years.
To
10 years.
To life imprisonment.
There's also life imprisonment.
Life imprisonment.
Right. The 3 clauses.
We also have a law under the Summary Jurisdiction Acts, which makes it illegal for a man to wear female clothing or for a woman to wear male clothing, really discriminating against people who have a different gender identity, who don't feel that their sex match their gender. So I think what we have done, or the colonial powers really have done with these laws, is to make unapprehended criminals out of a group of people, because it then says to society that these are the outcasts, these are the people that don't belong, and it furthers and perpetuates that stigma. And breeds an element almost of vigilante type justice. Okay, well, if they're not welcome, I could take justice into my own hands, and I could exact violence and discrimination, any form of exclusion or marginalization that I wish upon this group of people. So I think it's important to recognize the role the law plays in that, and that changing the law will not change those attitudes and opinions and perspectives overnight, but they will certainly create an environment which does not preclude people from claiming their rights.
But I would also like to add that there are other spin-offs in that the existence of these laws also fuel other behaviors that are morally improper. Corruption among public officers. You have a situation where, because people are of a particular sexual orientation and they may be caught in a particular disposition, some public officers, including policemen, may engage in some forms of extortion. So again, if you're talking about fighting corruption, then you have to see that our efforts in terms of fighting and managing corruption is also tandemic to these kinds of changes. You mentioned from my earlier intervention your recognition that even in societies where these laws exist, there is still violence. I agree, yes, but I don't want that to be understood and to be used as an objection to the process that we are embarking on. Because as a country, it is true that in the U.S.
is that we in Guyana, we are even more tolerant, even though we have laws that discriminate. Or the society as a whole, we do not
the level of violence is
the level of violence
comparatively
we do not
significant,
actively discriminate.
Yes. I don't know that we can say that because we aren't able to track hate crimes on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity for several reasons. Many people who are involved in acts of violence or discrimination don't report it on the basis of this, because it re-victimizes them. If you go to a police station...
But Joel, stick a pin. Even victims, women who are victims of rape, although you have the new law and so on, the problem of rape, for example, or domestic violence, the women who have been victims for a long time, whilst there is some greater sensitization to these issues, and it's been a long struggle, that still many women may not report a rape for a variety of reasons. Years and years ago, in the 40s and 50s, was shame, and you didn't want to be put in front. Now it's a different type of era, but the fact that Sexual Offences Act does not only talk, as in the old law, about rape meaning a rape of a female. It talks now about rape. Could be male, female,
any sexual
contact, or female. It doesn't say now that a woman can't,
any unwarranted sexual
because the whole
contact.
view that a woman can't rape a man, that is gone out the window now. So that I think that the victimology It's the victimology that's important. Whether the victim is a female or in the case of a person who's a homosexual who has been beaten or assaulted because he's homosexual. And I think that's the sensitization that so many people are in the closet, whether it is, and the people have to be able, people are not going to report if they feel that if they go to a police station, they might be laughed at.
But they can't report,
you know,
because
or they
how
say,
do
what
you
are
report?
you reporting it for?
How do you report when you are committing a crime?
Yeah, exactly.
In the context of
in the context
cannot,
of the
you
present
cannot,
law.
you cannot
So it was the
report.
same thing, for example, with, it's not a right analogy, but a similarity in the abortion laws, that it was a criminal offense, both for the whoever did it and for the person who was asking for it. Both could be locked up for 3 years each and so on. So that women were having illegal abortions. They were infertile. Women died as a result. And no one could go and say anything because they had committed a crime.
Yeah.
It was a criminal offense. So too with those who are involved in, whose sexual orientation is not what is the culturally acceptable one. They're not heterosexual, they're bisexual or homosexuals. How do they go to report that they may have been in a bar and a guy made a comment and he hit him, not because it's just two guys arguing, but they hit him deliberately because he's gay and they want to make an example of him or whatever. And so these are the issues that in bringing the discussion down, I do warn this process that we're embarking on is not going to be an easy road. It's not going to be an easy road. Having gone through and just for sharing experience, having gone through the process of bringing the medical termination of pregnancy, where if all the shouts of fire and brimstone and damnation, I wouldn't be here. Because bringing this law in was going to, Guyana was going to end. It would be swallowed up in a hole or something like that. And I understood where we were coming from. It took a process to get us to a vote of conscience in Parliament and to pass that law. Domestic violence, again, very, very controversial in the 90s, very, very controversial and nasty. I mean, and people said, women deserve to be beaten. How do you show a woman you love her unless you beat her? I mean, these are century-old ideas. And so even when Janet Jagan brought out the amendment to the Psychotropic Act to do with having a joint and have the magistrate being able to not send people to jail, there was an outcry against that. The Amerindian Act itself took a long time for debate because there were differences of views on how you deal with that. This is as we become more modern society, we get to a point, hopefully, where we are willing to engage on what are controversial issues and where we are willing to recognize that where issues of rights, that people have a right to those human rights. And people have a right to say, but I accept that, but I don't want, I don't agree with that. But I can still see that that's what is the correct thing to do for our society. And so I think that we've got to move this along. And so I'm hoping in the process that the parliamentary political parties, the different stakeholders, as Joel started out the program, professionals looking from the health angle, because if people are in the closet and they are fearful to come out, they may not use the health services in the way they should. I'm not only talking about HIV, AIDS, and sexually transmitted disease. I'm talking about a whole range of other health issues and that they need to be able to get out and deal with. What happens in school? What happens in university? What the private sector, labor unions, all these issues we have to look at, and to be able to bring them to a level. And so my thoughts on the process is to be able to bring the religious groups in a variety of ways to talk in a less, how do you call it, public and confrontational way. And to be able to sit with different religious bodies and say, look, we're not attacking your religion. We're not telling people not to believe in your religion. And for the religious group to recognize that you can have gays in your churches and your temples and imams. It doesn't mean that they're less religious because they're gay. And maybe that's going to be a highly debatable issue. But my view of my view of religion of God is, you know, a very merciful God, but maybe, and you know, I don't put a tag on him or her, but but I do believe that there's space in the churches, and it's been shown in other countries that gays and bisexuals, homosexuals, and so on, lesbians are active members of the religious community, and in many cases, in a number of religions, head the churches or become archbishops and bishops, knowing, publicly being known. That has caused controversies, but nevertheless, to me, they're not serving God less than someone who's heterosexual. And so we need to talk to the religious community so they don't feel threatened by this, or that in some way that we want to turn religion upside down. We don't. People are right to their faith, and their faith and what they believe in. But in every religion, there are people who have all sorts of transgressions, if we were all to try to say that.
This is more or less asking persons to confront their sensitivity.
Yeah, exactly.
And rationally deal with these sensitivities. And find a way of meeting the other side of society.
Yeah.
And as we say again, it's not asking that you accept.
Yeah.
It's just saying what we have already been doing as a society. We do not discriminate based strictly on sexual orientation. But let's get to the laws. I think
But
you have
I think
the laws there. Yeah.
If
Yes,
I-
Andrew.
And Joel was attempting to make a point that I don't at the same time want us to lose, because the whole process of law reform in the context of this discussion would also require us to pay attention to how we administrate the new laws, and how do we create opportunities for cooperation and collaboration among people with diverse interests. The United States of America, some states did pass laws that allow for the kind of reform in terms of relationships, marriages, and all of that. But yet, there was still evidence that there were a lot of hate crimes.
Yeah.
And that forced President Bush to initiate the hate crimes bill, which made it mandatory for certain particular types of crimes to be reported, and therefore to be included in the crime statistics. And so, again, I think Joel would have been attempting to introduce the whole idea of how do we process and administer the outcome of whatever reform in terms of our laws, you know, because we have to also think that through.
Yeah, but at this stage where we're at, we're not going to that level, because we don't want people to start saying, oh, we're going to do X, Y, Z. What we're looking at, and the commitment that was made, is that we'll consult on the issue, because at the end of the day, at the end of this whole consultation process, and that's why we're starting the discussion, is to get people to confront their sensitivities and say, look, these are the laws. What we're looking to do in the first instance, and this, Joel, you can tell me if this is what you're looking at. Removing the laws that discriminate. That's the first issue we need to look at. We need to have the laws that discriminate against persons strictly on their sexual orientation removed from our law books.
Yeah, definitely. I think Ms Teixeira made a very important point too about the new Sexual Offences Act and the fact that we have a gender
and that started
law.
it. That started it.
I think that's very important.
It moved from rape being strictly a female thing to it becoming gender neutral.
Yeah.
Because one of the impediments before that was that we needed the buggery laws to capture a rape of men.
Yeah.
Now that we have a gender neutral rape law and a robust piece of legislation which deals with pedophilia and that sort of thing, we really have no legitimate basis for having these laws which criminalize sex among adults on the books. And I really wanted to underscore that. I think it's important too to see the benefits of the repeal of the laws themselves beyond just removing institutional and legal forms of discrimination and helping us to address other issues like hate crimes, like targeted and biased violence. I think once we can open up our systems, our law enforcement agencies to be able to document, to be a bit more friendly towards particular groups. But if you have laws on the book which says these group of people are basically unapprehended criminals, then you already have started off with a framework which vitiates them from accessing justice. And I think that's a huge part of it. We can't deal with the violence and all the forms of discrimination. I heard Mr. Teixeira talk about education. So many of the transgender people we interview said that when they discover their transgender identity during puberty and they start to manifest that, they face extreme prejudice and violence in schools. Many of them have dropped out.
In their homes.
That too.
Right.
In homes,
Because,
schools, communities.
You think about domestic violence.
Religious institutions. But it has an impact on education because they drop out of school. So you have no education. You've never written CXC. So what do? You have to turn to sex work. So there are all of these ripple implications that I don't think we fully
appreciate. This is
appreciate.
more harmful to society than the actual act being committed between two adults.
I think it's harmful to the people who don't have other opportunities to earn livelihoods than to resort to a particular lifestyle because they haven't had, equal opportunity to education. But I think the point is to understand the ripple effects of the prejudice and discrimination that these laws breed.
I also think in the context of our discussion that it's also about building a democracy, because John Rawls made the very strong, incisive statement that democracy is also about providing people with lesser opportunity with greater opportunities. So, enhancing the opportunities of those with lesser opportunity, that is fundamental in terms of building our democracy. And this also helps that. But I also want to, at the same time, underscore the importance of protection of those who are different, not from a homosexual or a same-sex or a transgender perspective, but also from the heterosexual perspective. That this does not mean and should not mean that because there is or there will be whatever the law reform that comes out of this process, that it means that someone who's lesbian, gay, or transgender has the right to invade the privacy of one who's different or similar, that it's about protecting the rights of all. So it does not mean that someone who is, for the purpose of clarifying the discussion, who may be homosexual or transsexual, it doesn't mean that you have the right to invade the privacy of someone who perceive of themselves as heterosexual and vice versa. That it's all about ensuring that there is some consensual process that leads to your
whatever relationship.
Whatever relationship.
I agree with that. A huge part of it is that there's a right to privacy. And adults have the right to privacy, and the state really has no room in people's bedrooms. Once anybody is being heard, there's no physical violence. There's, this is adults consenting to particular forms of intimacy. What's the state role in that?
And the laws actually, when I read the laws, I found them amusing because how could the state enforce these laws? And let's look at what the law says, because
these are 1865, I believe.
We wanted to have someone from the Bar Association here, but
and I'm not the lawyer, so I'm not the expert, and these are the Criminal Law Offences Act, and this is Title 25, Offences Against Morality. So this is all in the 1865 context in the 19th century. So 2 centuries ago almost. And Section 351 talks about any male person who in public or private commits or is a party to the commission or procures or attempts to procure the commission by any male person of any act of gross indecency with any other male person shall be guilty of a misdemeanor and liable to imprison for 10 years. The issue of procurement and whether this is really prostitution you're talking about or solicitation of some form or other. 353 talks basically about buggery. And again, this is in the context that almost appears as if it is, all of these 3 clauses I read really look as if it's non-consensual. This is about an involuntary that a person is being subjected to. And so again, the Section 353 talks about buggery in particular. And again, it talks about assaults and as if it is not two willing partners. This is
One
one is
will, yeah.
imposing over the other, and that this is a felony and liable to imprisonment for 2 years. And then 353 talks about everyone who commits buggery shall be guilty of a felony and liable for imprisonment for life. So that these issues really talking about something different than what we're talking about. These laws provide or deal with something that's not what we're talking about. This is an issue of consenting adults having same sex and in a situation where they do not have to be afraid of being under these laws, being imprisoned or charged and stuff like that. And so I think the context of this is not in keeping with today, the language of today. There are a range of areas, whether it is in a whole range of other areas, for example, in prisons, in other places where these issues happen, the same sex takes place, but nobody wants to address it in a way to protect people and protect their health. But and generally in the law enforcement is that these people are breaking the law, but nobody gets charged in prison for that. So you have this duality, you know, the law is upheld, but at the same time it's not enforced, and at the same time they know it's happening, and in some cases it's rape. It is rape going on. The prison sometimes, many times, closes their eyes, pretends they don't see it when they very well know what's going on. So I think there are a variety of areas, but with these laws, I think that we have to look at other countries' experiences, what they've been able to do. Is it just repealing this, or is this putting something in its place in another part of other legislation, or is this all about repealing? Because I think if people know the language of the laws, they might have a different position. Yeah. They may not be in favor of lesbian, gays, bisexuals, and transgender. They still may not agree with that. But the law, when they read it, is one that is so antiquated and so out of context that they may think, you know, yeah, that law should go. But if you want me to go to the next stage, I might have, you know, that kind of talk. People say, I might have because people interpret sometimes that you want to bring a law in that says, yes, this is okay. And so there's a difference. You're talking about repealing. Obviously, there are other aspects. Does one go and look at a whole range of other acts where the language is not neutral? In the constitutional process, we talked about making the language gender neutral so as to allow for, and in the more recent laws, we've tried to insist on gender neutral language to make sure that whether it's male, female, or, as we said, gender, and define gender, therefore it could be applicable to a person who is bisexual, heterosexual, lesbian, and so forth.
I think you highlighted a particular problematic dimension of those laws is that they make no distinction between consensual and non-consensual acts.
Yes.
So you have a situation where you have now effectively criminalized private expressions of intimacy on par with acts of rape and sexual violence. Right. So what you've done by putting them in the same bracket is that you've stigmatized people who will find themselves in forms of sexual violence at the hands of same-sex partners. So even though you might have your new gender-neutral law under the Sexual Offences Act, continuing to perpetuate that whether you were raped by a man or you had sex with him voluntarily, they're almost equal in the eyes of the law.
Because of this act.
Because of this act.
Yeah. Because of that.
It re-stigmatizes them. So how does somebody like that, in a similar way to women who are raped and all those other examples that you share, come forward and access justice?
Yeah, I am not an authority on the law myself, but I think this particular act speaks to the whole issue of consenting opposites. Yeah. It promotes heterosexuality. And therefore, this particular act therefore infers that someone of same-sex orientation is not incapacitated, is unable to consent.
No, it's not because it doesn't deal with women.
Well,
Doesn't deal with lesbianism. It deals
that's the other issue.
basically with homosexuals. Am I right?
This strictly speaks about men
Yeah.
sleeping with
Does
men.
not
It
mention
doesn't
women.
mention anything
No.
to do with women.
No.
So what
in
the
fact,
law actually
lesbianism
says,
is okay
the
because there's no law
lesbianism
against
is
it.
okay because the law does not speak to lesbianism. It does not
Right.
speak
No, it doesn't
to two
criminalize it.
women in an intimate relationship. So there's no law that could be used to imprison or criminalize two women in a relationship.
Right.
But the law strictly speaks to two men in relationship, which means that which should really highlight to us the importance of having this removed, because it really, if you're so homophobic that you're worried about same-sex unions, then the law does not speak to that.
Well, I think the law presupposes the innocence or the non-participation of women. I'm not saying that this opposition
But
is
it's
correct.
1865,
But,
so
you know,
it's in the 1860s. So yes, we were not
Right.
considered more than property at that time. We were
certainly.
chattel.
So,
That's
hence
the
the
historical
emphasis on
context.
the male.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think too is, and this is the point Mr. Teixeira made about language, that while the law says one thing, the kind of media language that you hear about
Yeah.
is legalizing homosexuality.
Yeah.
So that is presented in a way which suggests same-sex orientation is illegal, and those kinds of discourses, which are not really accurate, perpetuate stigma and prejudice and discrimination against the entire community.
Yeah.
So lesbian is not to say that lesbian women are excluded from forms of discrimination that gay men face. The law doesn't criminalize their
Exactly.
forms of
That's the point.
intimacy, but they also face discrimination because in Jane Public's mind, all homosexuals are illegal. Yeah?
I think that's a good point for us to end with. Our time has
Wow.
quickly
Escaped us.
escaped us. But I know that this is the first in a series of discussions, and we will have further discussions involving other persons from different aspects, the different spheres of society, as we continue to discuss this topic and bring it to bear before the actual consultation starts. You've been watching discussions on discriminatory laws against lesbian, gays, bisexuals, and transgender people. I am your host, Raymon Cummings, and today we had in studio with us the Honorable Gail Teixeira, former Minister in the Ministries of Health, Culture, Youth, Sport, and Home Affairs. And, well, among other things, we had also Mr. Andrew Hicks, who is the head Department of Sociology, University of Guyana. He's a sociologist. And Mr. Joel Simpson, the founder and co-chair of SASOD. Quickly, before we go, 1 minute, your closing thoughts. Andrew.
Well, certainly this is all about a change process, and I do believe that the role of academics is critical in terms of presenting, engaging, and therefore creating opportunities for social change and for us to embrace humanity. Hence my participation, and it's been my pleasure.
Joel?
Well, I want to commend Ms. Teixeira for taking this initiative. I am increasingly optimistic that we can engage in a process which is inclusive and transparent and rational and civil, and have a real dialogue, a real discourse about these issues. I think the process itself is just as important as the outcome, as I mentioned before, and we look forward to working with and engaging with all key stakeholders as we roll out the consultations.
Well, thank you very much. I'm really pleased that we've begun talking about this issue, and we will be over the next month or two. We have to get over budget a bit, but inviting several NGOs, and the idea is to have some smaller roundtables of more personable discussions, some television programs in between, and certainly University of Guyana can have on their own. They don't need me, but I would certainly love to help if I'm needed. And that is, discussions on the campus, the involvement of the academicians, the students on dealing with these issues. Universities are supposed to be, the leading light on intellectual thought and enlightenment. And so to have these discussions and to lead up to a broader consultation. But I think if we need to start in small steps and go through many organizations and to create a comfort zone. If we go into this position of we and them, it's not going to work. And so by the time you get to the larger meetings, hopefully people are looking at things in a slightly different way, and then we may be able to come up with the best ideas and the best ways of how to address this issue.
Thank you very much, Andrew, Ms Texeira, and Joel. I'm Raymon Cummings saying thanks for watching, and please keep looking and be part of the consultations. Thank you.